The video camera doesn't blink. It captures everything with cold mechanical precision on that autumn night in 1992. Tony Pickman sits shirtless in the upstairs bedroom of a modest white clapboard house in Atchison, Kansas, speaking calmly to the investigators around him. Then his back arches. His face contorts, not in performance, but in genuine shock. The camera keeps rolling as three parallel lines materialize across his chest, thin trails of crimson appearing from nothing, as if an invisible hand is dragging claws through living flesh. No attacker, no explanation, just blood welling up in real time, while witnesses watch helplessly. This is the Sallie House, and it doesn't deal in theatrical whispers or convenient cold spots that can be explained away by drafty windows. What happens inside this unassuming home on North 2nd Street is something far more disturbing. 5 separate documented attacks. 5 times that something unseen crossed the line from supernatural phenomenon to physical assault. 5 instances where blood became evident. Most haunted locations trade in atmosphere and suggestion. The Sallie House offers scars. It offers documented injuries that required medical attention. It offers proof that whatever resides in those rooms is not content to merely frighten. It wants to harm. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. What kind of rage survives beyond death? What kind of fury lingers so intensely that it can tear open human skin decades or even centuries after its source drew final breath? What could make a spirit so violently, impossibly angry? Now. The house on North 2nd Street stands quiet in the morning light, its Victorian facade giving no hint of the tragedy that local legend claims unfolded within its walls over a century ago. According to the story that has become inextricably linked with this property, sometime in the early 1900s, a young girl named Sallie died here during what should have been a routine surgical procedure. She was only 6 years old, or perhaps 7 or 8 depending on which version of the tale you hear, and she had been suffering from acute appendicitis, a condition that terrified parents of that era with good reason. To understand how a child might have died on an operating table in this house, we need to step back into the medical landscape of early 20th century America. This was an era of profound transition in medicine, a time when surgery was becoming more common, but remained extraordinarily dangerous. The germ theory of disease had been accepted by the medical establishment for only a few decades. Antiseptic techniques existed, yes, but they were not uniformly practiced, especially in rural areas or in-home procedures. Many doctors still performed surgeries in private residences, transforming dining rooms or spare bedrooms into makeshift operating theaters with little more than clean linens and boiled instrument. Appendicitis presented a particular challenge. The condition could progress with terrifying speed, the infected appendix swelling and potentially rupturing within hours or days of the first symptoms. Once rupture occurred, peritonitis would set in, an infection of the abdominal cavity that was almost universally fatal before the advent of antibiotics. The only treatment was surgical removal of the appendix, an appendectomy, and the procedure had to be performed quickly, often with whatever resources were immediately available. Imagine the scene as it might have unfolded. A frantic mother arrives at the doctor's home with her daughter, the child doubled over in pain, her abdomen rigid and tender. The doctor examines her and makes his diagnosis. There is no time to transport her to a hospital, assuming one even existed within reasonable distance. The surgery must happen now, here, in this house. A table is cleared, perhaps in the same room that would later become someone's living room or bedroom. Water is set to boil. Instruments are laid out. The doctor's wife might assist, holding the child still, preparing the chloroform or ether that will render the little girl unconscious. Anesthesia itself was a gamble in those days. Chloroform had been used since the mid-1800s, but dosing remained more art than science. Too little, and the patient would wake during the procedure, experiencing unimaginable agony. Too much, and the heart could simply stop. Ether was somewhat safer but highly flammable and caused violent nausea. For children, calculating the correct dose was especially difficult. Their smaller bodies metabolized these substances differently, and there were no monitoring devices, no way to measure blood oxygen levels or heart rate with precision. The legend suggests that something went wrong during Sallie's surgery. Some versions claim the doctor operated without sufficient anesthesia, that the child awoke during the procedure and died from the shock and trauma. Others suggest complications from the infection itself, that her appendix had already ruptured before the surgery began, and sepsis claimed her life despite the doctor's best efforts. Still others whispered darker possibilities, that the doctor was incompetent or intoxicated, that his hand slipped, that he cut something he shouldn't have. What we can say with certainty is that childhood death was far more common then than now. In the early 1900s, roughly 1 in 10 children died before reaching their first birthday, and many more succumbed to illness or injury before adulthood. Families expected to lose children. It was a grim reality of the era. Operating on a child with acute appendicitis in a home setting would have carried enormous risk, perhaps a 50% mortality rate or worse, depending on how advanced the infection had become. But here's where the story of Sallie begins to unravel under scrutiny. When researchers have attempted to verify the historical record, they've encountered significant obstacles. Property records from the early 1900s are incomplete, but what documentation does exist raises questions about whether a doctor ever actually lived and practiced in this particular house during the relevant time period. City directories, which typically listed professional offices, show no physician's practice at this address. Census records from 1900, 1910, and 1920 paint a picture of the house's occupants, but none appear to have been medical doctors. Some local historians have suggested that the legend might be a case of address confusion, that perhaps a doctor did practice elsewhere in the neighborhood, and the story became attached to the wrong house over the decades. Others point out that many doctors in that era worked from their homes, but didn't formally list them as offices, making historical verification nearly impossible. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes, but it does complicate matters. Then there's the question of Sallie herself. No death certificate has been located for a child by that name who died during surgery in this town during the early 1900s. No obituary. No grave marker in the local cemeteries that matches the story. Researchers have checked variations of the name, Sarah, Sallie, Salome, thinking perhaps the name had been misremembered or softened over time. Still nothing definitive. Yet despite these historical gaps, or perhaps because of them, the ghost story has flourished. Residents of the house, particularly during the 1990s when the property gained notoriety, reported frequent encounters with what they described as a child spirit. Witnesses claimed to see a young girl in old-fashioned clothing, her dark hair pinned back, her dress reaching to her ankles as would have been typical for the era. She appeared most often in the upstairs rooms and was described as playful rather than threatening. Objects would move inexplicably. Toys left in one room would appear in another. Childish laughter echoed through empty hallways. One tenant reported finding all of her daughter's stuffed animals arranged in a circle, as if for a tea party, though no living person had been in that room. Another described repeatedly finding pennies lined up in neat rows on windowsills and countertops, appearing overnight when the house had been locked and empty. The spirit seemed drawn to children in particular. Families with young daughters reported that their children would talk about their friend Sallie, describing conversations and games played with someone no adult could see. These accounts carried an eerie innocence. The children weren't frightened. They seemed to genuinely enjoy the company of their invisible playmate. Parents would hear their daughters laughing in their bedrooms and find them alone, insisting that Sallie had just told them a funny story or helped them build a block tower. This characterization of Sallie as a benign, even friendly presence became central to the legend. Here was a child ghost, lonely perhaps, seeking companionship and play. The narrative had a certain tragic sweetness to it. A little girl who died too young, now trapped between worlds, looking for friends, for comfort, for the childhood that had been stolen from her. But then there were the other incidents, the ones that didn't fit the profile of an innocent child spirit at all. Tenants reported being pushed by invisible hands on the stairs. Scratches appeared on people's bodies overnight, angry red welts in sets of 3 or 4, like marks from fingernails. Objects weren't just moved, they were thrown. Picture frames sailed off walls. Dishes flew from cabinets and shattered. One resident claimed to have been held down in bed by an unseen force, unable to move or cry out, feeling pressure on his chest like someone sitting on him. A paranormal investigation team that visited the house in the mid-1990s documented temperature fluctuations of 20 degrees within seconds, concentrated in specific rooms. They captured photographs showing strange lights and shadowy forms. Most disturbingly, they recorded audio that seemed to contain voices responding to their questions, and not all of those voices sounded young or female. The most troubling incident involved a man who lived in the house temporarily. He was a skeptic, dismissive of the ghost stories, chalking them up to overactive imaginations and creaky old houses. His skepticism reportedly enraged whatever presence dwelled there. He began experiencing violent phenomena. Doors would slam in his face. He claimed something invisible attacked him in the bathroom, leaving deep scratches across his back. He moved out within weeks. Here's the paradox that has troubled researchers and paranormal enthusiasts alike. If Sallie is indeed the spirit of a young child, a victim of medical tragedy, why would she behave with such violence? Children can be temperamental, certainly, prone to tantrums and emotional outbursts. But the level of aggression reported in this house seems inconsistent with the playful, innocent girl seen playing with toys and seeking the company of other children. Some have suggested that the spirit of a child who died in pain and fear might retain that trauma, lashing out from a place of confusion and suffering. The terror of waking during surgery, if that's indeed what happened, could theoretically imprint itself, creating a presence capable of both innocent play and violent rage. Childhood doesn't always mean innocence, after all. It can also mean lack of control, emotional volatility, the inability to properly process or express pain. But there's another possibility, one that those who have spent time investigating this house have begun to quietly voice. What if Sallie isn't alone? What if the playful child's spirit is real? But there's something else here too. Something older and considerably darker. What if the violent incidents have nothing to do with the ghost of a little girl, and everything to do with a separate entity that shares this space? That possibility changes everything. It suggests this house might harbor multiple presences, each with their own history, their own agenda, and it raises a far more unsettling question. If something other than Sallie is responsible for the attacks, then what exactly is it, and why has it remained here all this time? NL. The autumn of 1992 brought the Pickman family to 500 North 2nd Street, with all the ordinary hopes and anxieties that accompany any young family's first real home. Debra and Tony Pickman had saved for 3 years to afford the down payment on the 2-story colonial, their real estate agent assuring them the price reflected nothing more sinister than outdated wallpaper and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since the 1970s. Their infant daughter, barely 8 months old, gurgled contentedly in Debra's arms as they signed the papers, oblivious to the threshold they were about to cross. The house had good bones, as Tony liked to say. High ceilings, original hardwood floors beneath the stained carpeting, and a spacious nursery on the 2nd floor that caught the morning light just perfectly. Debra had spent weeks before the move painting that room herself, choosing a soft yellow that felt gender-neutral and cheerful, stenciling a border of alphabet blocks along the crown molding. She'd arranged the crib beneath the window, positioned the changing table against the far wall, and lined up stuffed animals on the shelf with the meticulous care of a first-time mother who believed that if she just got the environment right, everything else would fall into place. The first week passed in the blur of unpacking, of finding places for things, of learning the house's ordinary sounds. Which floorboards creaked, which pipes knocked when the water ran, which door hinges needed oil. Tony worked long hours as a machinist at the factory outside town, often pulling double shifts to cover the new mortgage, which meant Debra spent most of her time alone with the baby in that big, unfamiliar house. It was on the 8th night that the mobile above the crib began to move. Not the gentle rotation caused by air currents, but a deliberate musical spinning that woke Debra from the light sleep all new mothers develop. She stood in the nursery doorway, watching the pastel animals circle in the darkness, their shadows sliding across the walls like fingers. The mechanical lullaby played its tinny tune, though she distinctly remembered not winding it before putting the baby down. Her daughter slept through it peacefully, tiny fists curled near her face, utterly serene. Debra told herself she must have wound it without thinking, muscle memory taking over during the exhausted routine of bedtime. She climbed back into bed and tried to ignore the faint music still playing down the hall. The toys began activating regularly after that. The stuffed bear that played a recorded message when you squeezed its paw would suddenly speak in the middle of the afternoon, its cheerful voice announcing, "I love you," to the empty room. The jack-in-the-box Debra had relegated to the closet because it frightened her would spring open with a bang that made her heart race, though she'd never touched the crank. The Fisher-Price radio would turn on by itself, static hissing between stations before settling on classical music that Debra had never programmed. What disturbed her most was that these incidents never seemed to frighten the baby. In fact, her daughter appeared calmed by them, would stop fussing the moment a toy activated, her eyes tracking to the sound with what looked almost like recognition. During one particularly difficult teething evening, when the baby had been screaming for hours, and Debra was near tears herself, the mobile had begun to spin without warning, and her daughter had quieted immediately, mesmerized by the movement, and fallen asleep within minutes. Debra mentioned the toys to Tony, trying to keep her voice light, casual. He suggested the batteries were dying, causing electrical glitches. He checked them all, replaced them with fresh ones, and the activity stopped for 3 days. Debra let herself believe his rational explanation. Then the nursery light began turning itself on at exactly 2:17 every morning, and the pattern she'd been trying to deny became impossible to ignore. She started keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the desperate precision of someone trying to prove their sanity to themselves. September 23rd, mobile spinning, 2:45 a.m. September 26th, teddy bear activated, 4:12 p.m. October 1st, all toys in nursery found rearranged, formation unclear but deliberate. She showed Tony the journal one Sunday morning over coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the notebook across the table. He read through her careful notes with a furrowed brow, then reached across and squeezed her hand. "Sleep deprivation," he suggested gently. The stress of new motherhood. His sister had experienced something similar with her first baby, thought she was losing her mind from exhaustion. Maybe Debra should see the doctor, just to talk, just to make sure she wasn't pushing herself too hard. That night, alone with the baby while Tony worked a graveyard shift, Debra stood in the nursery and spoke to the empty air. If something was there, she said, she wasn't angry. If it meant no harm to her daughter, if it was somehow watching over her baby, she could accept that. The house settled around her words with what felt like acknowledgement. And for a moment, Debra felt an odd sense of peace. The scratches appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. Debra had been folding laundry in the nursery while the baby napped, radio playing softly on the dresser, autumn sunlight streaming through the window making everything feel safe and domestic. She reached up to adjust the curtain and felt a sudden burning sensation across her left forearm. 3 parallel lines appeared on her skin as she watched, thin wells rising red and angry from wrist to elbow, as though invisible nails had dragged deliberately across her flesh. She stumbled backward, clutching her arm, and the room temperature dropped so precipitously she could see her breath. The radio cut to static. The baby stirred but didn't wake, and Debra found herself frozen, staring at her arm, at the marks that were definitely there, that were beginning to bead with blood, that she absolutely had not made herself. She called Tony at work, trying to keep the hysteria out of her voice and failing. He came home early, examined the scratches under the bathroom light, and insisted they looked like she'd caught her arm on something, the corner of the changing table maybe, or a rough edge on the crib. But Debra had been nowhere near the crib. She knew what she'd felt. She knew what she'd seen. The scratches faded over the next few days, leaving faint white lines that would become permanent scars. Debra found herself wearing long sleeves even indoors, hyper-aware of her skin, waiting for the next attack. It came the following week. Tony had left for a 3-day training seminar, kissing her goodbye with promises to call every night, reassuring her she'd be fine. They'd be fine. The first night passed quietly. The second night, Debra woke at 2:17 to find her shoulders burning. She reached back and felt wetness, pulled her hand away to find her fingers dark with blood. In the bathroom mirror, she discovered 4 deep scratches across each shoulder blade, symmetrical, deliberate, the pattern of hands that had reached through her nightgown and marked her while she slept. She called Tony sobbing, and he drove home through the night, arriving at dawn to find her sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, the baby playing contentedly in her playpen, Debra's shoulders bandaged with dishcloths she'd pressed to the wounds. He saw the scratches this time, couldn't deny them, couldn't explain them. They went to the emergency room, where a doctor asked careful questions about whether Debra felt safe at home, whether anyone was hurting her, whether she might be hurting herself. Tony's face had flushed with anger at the implication, but Debra had felt only numbness. How could she explain that something invisible had attacked her, that she could feel it watching her, feel its attention like weight pressing against her skin? The doctor prescribed antibiotics for infection and gave her a referral to a psychiatrist. Tony took a week off work. The house remained quiet during those days, as though whatever lived there was hiding, waiting for him to leave again. When he finally returned to work, the activity resumed immediately. Debra would feel it watching her from doorways, from corners, from the shadows that gathered in the upstairs hallway. The temperature would drop when she entered certain rooms. Objects would move at the periphery of her vision. And always, the baby remained unaffected, protected, while Debra bore the brunt of whatever malevolent attention focused on her. She began to notice a pattern. Tony could walk through the house without incident. The mailman, mail. The electrician Tony called to check the wiring, mail. All unbothered. But when her mother came to visit, the woman lasted only 2 hours before complaining of feeling unwelcome, watched, and left with excuses about traffic. When Debra's sister stayed for a weekend, she woke screaming the first night from dreams of being strangled and refused to spend another night under that roof. The scratches continued. On her arms, her shoulders, once across her collarbone, and marks that looked disturbingly like a handprint. Debra started sleeping with the baby in the nursery, the only room that felt safe, the only place where the presence seemed protective rather than predatory. She would lie awake in the darkness, listening to her daughter's gentle breathing, and feel the attention shift around her like currents in deep water. It was during one of these long nights, watching the mobile spin slowly above the crib without any apparent cause, that Debra finally accepted what she'd been trying to deny. The house didn't just have a presence, it had an agenda. The phenomena had seemed benign at first, protective even, because they were focused on the baby. But that protection came with a price, and Debra was paying it. Whatever haunted 508 North 2nd Street loved the baby and hated Debra with equal intensity. She could feel it in the way the air turned hostile when she was alone, in the way scratches appeared only when Tony was absent, in the way every attack felt personal, targeted, deliberate. The presence wasn't mindless or random. It was conscious and calculating, and it had decided Debra was a threat. The realization crystallized one November evening as she stood in the nursery, fresh scratches burning on her ribs, watching her daughter smile at something over Debra's shoulder. Something she couldn't see but could feel breathing against the back of her neck. Whatever was there, it didn't want to harm the baby. It wanted to replace Debra. It wanted to be the mother. And as she stood there, feeling its attention like hands hovering just above her skin, Debra understood with cold certainty that this was only the beginning. The attacks would escalate. The violence would intensify. Because whatever haunted this house didn't just hate her. It hated all women. And it had only just begun to show her how much. The attacks on Tony Pickman began with a subtlety that made them all the more disturbing. In the weeks following the entity's escalation in the house, witnesses noticed that the invisible force seemed to be observing, studying, choosing its next target with an intelligence that contradicted any natural explanation. And when it finally turned its full attention to Tony, it did so with a calculated brutality that would leave even seasoned paranormal researchers questioning everything they thought they understood about the boundaries between the living and the dead. The first incident occurred on a Thursday evening in late October, when Tony was alone in the upstairs bathroom. He had been washing his face, preparing for bed, when he felt a sudden burning sensation across his left shoulder blade. The pain was immediate and intense, like being dragged across broken glass. When he twisted to look in the mirror, pulling his shirt over his head, he saw 3 parallel scratches running diagonally across his back. The wounds were fresh, beading with blood, each line perfectly spaced from the others as though drawn with a ruler. But he had been completely alone. The bathroom door was locked. There was no possible explanation for how these marks had appeared on a part of his body. He could not reach himself. Debra found him standing there, staring at his reflection, his shirt bunched in his hands. She would later tell researchers that the look on his face was not one of pain or even fear, but confusion. A deep, unsettling confusion that suggested he was trying to reconcile what his eyes were showing him with what his mind knew to be possible. She photographed the wounds that night with their personal camera, documenting the 3 distinct claw marks, each approximately 4 inches long, each cutting deep enough into the skin to leave scars that Tony would carry for the rest of his life. But this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, the attacks increased in frequency and severity. Tony would be sitting at the dinner table, reaching for a glass of water, when witnesses would see him suddenly flinch and gasp. Rolling up his sleeve would reveal fresh scratches appearing on his forearm, 3 parallel lines that seemed to materialize from nowhere, blood welling up in their wake. He would be standing in the kitchen, talking with Debra about mundane household matters, when crimson streaks would appear across his neck, the skin parting as if sliced by invisible claws. Each attack left the same signature, 3 marks, perfectly parallel, cutting deeper than any surface scratch should go. The paranormal research team that had been documenting activity in the house began spending longer periods on site, setting up cameras in multiple rooms, determined to capture evidence of these attacks. Dr. Richard Holsworth, a psychologist specializing in anomalous phenomena, was particularly interested in the pattern of the wounds. He noted in his field journal that the scratches appeared inconsistent with self-infliction, both in their location and their depth. Some appeared on Tony's back, in positions anatomically impossible for him to reach. Others crossed over his ribcage at angles that would require an external force. The spacing between the 3 lines remained eerily consistent, suggesting whatever was making these marks had a fixed, unchanging form. Margaret Chen, a psychic investigator who had worked on dozens of reported haunting cases, was present for what would become the most thoroughly documented attack. It was a Saturday afternoon in early November, and the research team had set up their equipment in the living room where much of the activity seemed concentrated. Tony was sitting on the couch, perfectly calm, discussing his experiences with the team. Margaret would later describe the moment in her official report with a clarity that suggested the memory would never leave her. She said the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, dramatically, enough that everyone present could see their breath misting in the air. Tony stopped speaking mid-sentence. His eyes went distant, unfocused, as though he was listening to something only he could hear. Then the blood came. Margaret watched as a dark stain began spreading across Tony's chest, soaking through his light blue shirt in 3 distinct lines. He did not react immediately, did not cry out or move to protect himself. He simply sat there as the fabric darkened with his blood, as the witness accounts would later confirm. When he finally lifted his shirt, the team saw the wounds opening in real time. The skin was parting, 3 parallel gashes appearing across his chest, blood flowing freely from cuts that seemed to deepen as they watched. The team's photographer, Daniel Reeves, captured the entire sequence on film. The photographs would later be analyzed by medical professionals who confirmed that the wounds appeared consistent with deep lacerations from a clawed hand, except there was no hand. No visible source. Just Tony sitting on a couch, bleeding from wounds that should not exist. Dr. Holsworth examined Tony immediately after this incident, documenting the injuries with clinical precision. The 3 scratches ran from just below Tony's left collarbone down across his chest, each approximately 6 inches long. The wounds were deep, requiring medical attention and eventual stitching at the local emergency room. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Simmons, noted in her medical report that the lacerations were consistent with an animal attack, possibly from a large cat or similar creature with retractable claws. But there had been no animal. Only Tony, sitting in a room full of witnesses, bleeding from wounds inflicted by something no one could see. The physical toll on Tony became increasingly apparent as the weeks progressed. The scratches accumulated across his body like a grotesque map of the entity's obsession. His torso bore dozens of marks in various stages of healing, some fresh and angry, others faded to silver scars. His arms showed similar damage, 3-line patterns crisscrossing from shoulder to wrist. His back, which he could not see without assistance, bore the deepest wounds, some cutting through multiple layers of tissue. Medical professionals who examined him noted that the injury patterns defied conventional explanation. The depth and precision of the cuts suggested deliberate violence, yet Tony insisted, and witnesses confirmed, that there was never any visible attacker. The psychological deterioration followed closely behind the physical. Tony, who had been the more skeptical of the couple when the haunting began, became withdrawn and distant. Friends who visited the house reported that he seemed somehow diminished, as though something vital was being slowly drained from him. He developed dark circles under his eyes from chronic sleep deprivation, flinching at sounds only he could hear. His weight dropped noticeably as eating became difficult, every meal interrupted by the anticipation of pain, the waiting for the next attack that could come at any moment. Debra begged him to leave. She proposed they move out immediately, abandon the house to whatever force had claimed it. But Tony refused with a stubbornness that troubled everyone who knew him. This refusal became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case for the research team. Margaret Chen noted in her reports that Tony's determination to stay in the house seemed inconsistent with his obvious suffering. When questioned about why he would not leave, his answers were vague and contradictory. Sometimes he claimed they could not afford to move. Other times he insisted the attacks would follow them wherever they went. And occasionally, in moments that unsettled even experienced investigators, he would say simply that he could not leave, as though the choice was no longer his to make. Dr. Holsworth began to explore a theory that would divide the research team and raise troubling questions about the nature of the haunting. He proposed that the attacks on Tony might not be attacks at all, but rather a process of possession or control. He noted that during the documented incidents, Tony's demeanor changed significantly. The distant look in his eyes, the lack of immediate pain response, the strange passivity with which he accepted the wounds appearing on his body. These behaviors suggested to Holsworth that Tony might not be fully present during the attacks, that something else might be operating through him, using his body as a canvas for its rage. This theory gained traction after an incident witnessed by multiple team members in late November. Tony was standing in the kitchen when he suddenly raised his right hand to his left forearm and appeared to drag his fingernails across his own skin. But witnesses reported that his movements seemed mechanical, puppet-like, as though his arm was being guided by an external force. The resulting scratches followed the familiar pattern. 3 parallel lines, deeper than any self-inflicted wound should reasonably be. When the moment passed and Tony lowered his hand, he seemed confused by the blood on his arm, asking what had happened as though he had no memory of his own actions. The medical impossibility of the wounds became a focal point for skeptics and believers alike. Forensic pathologist Dr. James Morrison examined photographs and medical reports from Tony's numerous emergency room visits. He concluded that, while the wounds were certainly real and potentially life-threatening if they continued, their origin remained unexplained. The depth and precision of the cuts were inconsistent with accidental injury. The patterns suggested an intelligent source, something capable of repeatedly creating identical 3-line formations. Yet no weapon or implement was ever found, no logical explanation ever established. The photographic evidence collected by the research team provided irrefutable documentation that something extraordinary was occurring. The sequence of images showing Tony's shirt saturating with blood as wounds opened across his chest became one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the paranormal research community. The photographs clearly showed the progression of the attack. Tony sitting calmly, then the first signs of blood appearing through the fabric, then the spreading stains, then the revelation of the open wounds beneath. No tricks of light or camera angles could explain the documented sequence of events witnessed by multiple professionals. As December approached, the attacks on Tony intensified to a point that even he could no longer deny the danger he was in. He was being wounded almost daily, sometimes multiple times in a single day. His body bore so many scratches in various stages of healing that he looked, as one witness described, like he had been living with a wild animal. The psychological impact was equally severe. He began speaking about the entity as though it was a presence he could sense constantly, watching him, waiting for moments of vulnerability to strike. He told Margaret Chen during one interview that he sometimes felt he was not alone in his own body, that there were thoughts and urges that did not feel like his own. The question that haunted the researchers became increasingly urgent as they watched Tony's condition deteriorate. Was this man being victimized by an external supernatural force? Or was something far more sinister occurring? Was the entity attacking Tony, marking him, claiming him as a victim? Or had it already succeeded in establishing a foothold inside him, using his own hands to create wounds that served some purpose beyond human understanding? The 3 scratch claw marks that appeared with such regularity might have been signatures of violence, or they might have been something else entirely. Messages, perhaps, symbols in a language written in blood and pain. The truth, as it often is in cases that challenge our understanding of reality, remained elusive. But what was undeniable was that Tony Pickman had become the focus of something that should not exist, something that expressed itself through violence etched into human flesh, something that raised questions about the nature of consciousness, free will, and the terrible possibility that we might not always be the sole inhabitants of our own body. The pain came without warning in the depths of a February night in 1994. Tony Pickman had survived nearly 4 years in the house that locals had come to whisper about. He had endured the footsteps that shook the walls, the phantom voices that called his name in the darkness, the oppressive weight that sometimes descended on his chest as he slept. He had watched shadows move with apparent intelligence through his home, had felt unseen hands brush against his skin, had awakened to the sound of breathing that did not belong to anyone living. Through it all, he had remained, stubbornly determined not to be driven from the property he had purchased with his life savings. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what happened that night. He woke at 3:17 in the morning, not to a sound or a presence, but to agony unlike anything he had ever experienced. His chest was on fire. The sensation was so immediate, so overwhelming, that for several seconds he could not even draw breath to scream. When he finally managed to inhale, the sound that tore from his throat brought his wife Margaret running from the bathroom where she had been unable to sleep, plagued as she had been for weeks by the feeling of being watched. The bedroom light revealed a scene that would be seared into Margaret's memory for the rest of her life. Her husband was thrashing in the bed, clawing at his chest, his face contorted in a mask of pure terror and pain. She ran to him, trying to hold his hands away from his torso, afraid he would injure himself further. When she managed to pull his hands aside and saw what lay beneath, she began to scream as well. Tony's chest was covered in burns. Not the kind of burns that develop slowly, not the gradual reddening of sunburned skin or the accidental brush against a hot surface. These were severe, blistering burns that appeared to be forming even as Margaret watched. The skin was angry red, already beginning to bubble and weep in places, but it was the pattern that made her blood run cold. The burns were not random. They formed distinct shapes across his chest and upper abdomen. Symbols, crosses, geometric patterns that seemed to have been deliberately placed. Margaret's hands shook as she dialed 911. The dispatcher later reported that she could barely understand the woman's words through her hysterical sobbing. All she could make out was that a man was burning, that he was on fire, that there was no fire. The dispatcher sent an ambulance immediately, flagging the call as a possible chemical exposure or attack. The paramedics who arrived at 3:41 that morning found Tony Pickman in shock, his vital signs dangerously unstable. Lead paramedic James Corrigan would later provide testimony to investigators about what he witnessed. He had been working emergency medicine for 17 years at that point, had seen burn victims from house fires, car accidents, industrial incidents, and domestic violence situations. He knew what burns looked like, how they presented, how they smelled. What he saw on Tony Pickman's chest that night violated every principle of burn injury he had been trained to recognize. The burns were fresh, still forming blisters, the kind of presentation consistent with recent exposure to extreme heat. But there was no heat source anywhere in the bedroom. The paramedics checked for chemical burns, for caustic substances that might have been spilled or deliberately applied. They found nothing. The bed sheets were cool to the touch. There was no smell of burning fabric, no residue of accelerants, no evidence of any external source that could have caused such injuries. The burns appeared to have originated from beneath the skin itself. Tony was rushed to St. Michael's Hospital, where he was immediately taken to the burn unit. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, began her examination while nurses worked to start IV fluids and administer pain medication. What she documented in her medical report would become one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in the entire Pickman case. The burns covered approximately 18% of Tony's chest and upper abdomen. They were classified as second-degree burns, deep enough to cause blistering and damage to the dermis layer of skin. The patterns were unmistakable. Dr. Chen's report specifically noted the presence of what appeared to be deliberately formed symbols. She documented 3 distinct cross shapes, each approximately 4 inches in height, positioned across the upper chest. Below these were geometric patterns that she described as resembling inverted triangles within circles. The precision of the shapes was what disturbed her most. Burns from accidental contact with heat sources are typically irregular, following the contours of whatever hot object caused them. These burns had sharp edges, clean lines, symmetrical proportions. Dr. Chen called in Dr. Robert Morrison, the hospital's leading burn specialist, for a consultation. Morrison had published extensively on burn pathology and had testified as an expert witness in numerous criminal cases involving burn injuries. He arrived at the hospital at 6:30 that morning and spent over 2 hours examining Tony Pickman. His findings, documented in a supplementary medical report that remains part of the hospital's permanent records, are extraordinary for their candor. Dr. Morrison stated unequivocally that in his 32 years of medical practice, he had never encountered burns that presented in this manner. He ruled out all conventional causes. The depth and severity of the burns indicated exposure to temperatures of at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit for a sustained period. Yet there was no corresponding damage to any clothing or bedding. The burns showed no signs of chemical causation, no evidence of electrical injury, no indication of radiation exposure. They had simply appeared, spontaneously, on Tony Pickman's chest. What Dr. Morrison found most troubling, what he admitted in later interviews kept him awake at night, was the biological impossibility of what he was observing. Human skin does not spontaneously combust. It does not generate the kind of heat necessary to cause second-degree burns from within. There is no known medical condition that could produce such an effect. When pressed by investigators, Dr. Morrison provided a statement that was remarkable for a man of science. He said, and this is a direct quote from the hospital inquiry, "I can document what happened to Mr. Pickman's body. I can measure the depth of the burns, classify their severity, and provide treatment. What I cannot do, what no one can do, is explain how they occurred. This case defies medical explanation." 911. Tony remained in the burn unit for 6 days. During that time, his injuries were photographed extensively, both for medical documentation and at the request of the local police, who had opened an investigation into possible assault. The photographs reveal the full extent of the markings. Beyond the crosses and geometric shapes on his chest, there were smaller symbols scattered across his abdomen. Burn specialists who have reviewed the photographs have noted that some of the patterns appear almost deliberate, as if carefully inscribed. It was Margaret who first suggested they show the photographs to someone outside the medical community. She had been doing research, desperately trying to understand what had happened to her husband. She had started looking into occult symbolism, into ritualistic practices, into things she had never believed in before that terrible night. She found a reference to Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a professor of comparative religion at the State University, who had published papers on ritualistic practices and symbolic imagery in various spiritual traditions. Dr. Hartley agreed to examine the medical photographs. What she told the Pickmans during their meeting would fundamentally change how they understood what had happened. She identified several of the symbols as having origins in protective magic, specifically in traditions designed to ward off evil or malevolent spiritual entities. But there was something wrong with them, something reversed. The crosses were inverted in subtle ways. The triangular symbols were positioned in configurations that, according to her research, were associated not with protection, but with binding and marking. She explained to them a concept that exists in various occult traditions, the idea of protective wards being turned against their intended beneficiary. In some beliefs, symbols meant to protect can be corrupted, inverted, used to claim rather than shield. She spoke carefully, qualifying her statements, making clear that she was describing belief systems, not asserting metaphysical facts. But the implication was clear. If one believed in such things, if one accepted the premise of malevolent spiritual entities, then what had happened to Tony could be interpreted as a kind of branding. a marking, a claiming of ownership. The Pickmans also consulted with Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who had experience with cases of reported spiritual oppression. Father O'Brien examined the symbols and came to a similar conclusion as Dr. Hartley. He described the patterns as resembling corrupted religious imagery, sacred symbols deliberately perverted. He told them that in cases of what the church classified as demonic oppression or possession, physical manifestations sometimes occurred. Scratches, bruises, and yes, in rare cases, burns. He had seen documentation of such phenomena, though he admitted he had never encountered a case as severe as Tony's. The theory that emerged from these consultations was as terrifying as it was unprovable. Something in that house, some presence or entity that had tormented the Pickman family for years, had escalated its attacks to a new level. It was no longer content with psychological terror, with moving objects and phantom sounds. It was asserting a more direct claim. The burns were a message, a brand, a mark of possession. Tony Pickman had been claimed. The attacks did not stop with that first night. 3 days after Tony returned home from the hospital, still bandaged and medicated, he woke again to burning pain. This time, the burns appeared on his back, between his shoulder blades. They were less severe than the chest burns, classified as first degree, but they followed the same impossible pattern. They appeared without any external heat source, forming distinct shapes that Margaret photographed before rushing him back to the hospital. Dr. Chen examined him again. She found no medical explanation for this second occurrence. The burns were real, measurable, treatable, but their origin remained a mystery. She recommended psychiatric evaluation, suggesting possible psychosomatic causes, though she acknowledged that psychosomatic symptoms did not typically produce actual physical burns of this severity. The third incident occurred a week later. Tony did not wake up this time. Margaret found him unconscious in the hallway outside their bedroom at 2 a.m, fresh burns across his left forearm. The pattern this time resembled writing, though in no alphabet that linguists could later identify. It was this third attack that broke them. Margaret told investigators later that she knew, with absolute certainty, that if they stayed in that house, it would kill her husband. Whatever was there, whatever had been tormenting them since 1990, was accelerating toward a conclusion she could not allow. They left on March 15, 1994. They packed only essential belongings, loaded them into their car, and drove away from the house they had fought so hard to keep. Tony was still recovering from the burns, still heavily medicated for pain, but they could not wait another day. They drove to Margaret's sister's house, 40 miles away, and never returned. The detail that Margaret would repeat over and over in subsequent interviews, the detail that seems almost too perfect, too dramatically convenient to be believed, is this. The moment they crossed the property line, the burning sensation that had been constant on Tony's chest for weeks simply stopped. He described it as a light switch being flipped. One moment, the persistent low-level pain that had become his constant companion was there. The next moment, as their car's back wheels passed the boundary of their property, it vanished completely. They tried to sell the house. They listed it with 3 different real estate agencies over the following year. Each time, potential buyers would schedule viewings and then cancel. Some left messages explaining they had felt uncomfortable during their visit. Others simply never showed up for scheduled appointments. The house remained empty, the Pickmans continuing to pay the mortgage from a distance. Unable to return, unable to sell. Tony's burns healed over the following months, leaving scars that he carries to this day. Medical follow-ups found no ongoing physical damage beyond the scarring. Psychologically, the damage was more profound. He underwent therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, his sleep permanently disrupted by nightmares of burning. The medical documentation from St. Michael's Hospital remains. The photographs exist. The testimony of Dr. Chen and Dr. Morrison is on record. Whatever one believes about the supernatural, about spiritual entities and occult forces, the physical evidence of what happened to Tony Pickman cannot be disputed. His body was marked, burned in patterns that medical science cannot explain, by forces that left no trace of their passage except the damage they inflicted. Something, whether explicable or not, whether nameable or not, had touched him in that house, and it had left its mark. The Pickman family fled their home in 1994. leaving behind boxes of documentation, photographs of scratches and bruises, and tape recordings filled with strange sound. But their departure didn't mark the end of the Pickman house story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of something far more disturbing. Because, after the Pickmans left, the house drew a different kind of attention. Not families looking for a place to call home, but researchers seeking to understand what had driven the previous occupants away in terror. Between 1994 and 2001, 7 different paranormal investigation teams entered the Pickman house. Each group came equipped with increasingly sophisticated technology: night vision cameras, electromagnetic field detectors, digital voice recorders capable of capturing frequencies beyond normal human hearing, thermal imaging devices that could detect temperature fluctuations to fractions of a degree. They came prepared to document, to measure, to prove or disprove the claims that had turned this ordinary suburban house into something notorious within paranormal research circles. The first teams reported standard activity: cold spots in the master bedroom, odd sounds that seemed to have no source, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be easily explained. Some researchers felt watched, uncomfortable, anxious to leave certain rooms. But nothing violent occurred during those early investigations. Nothing that crossed the line from unsettling to dangerous. The entity, if it existed, seemed content to observe these visitors rather than engage with them. That pattern changed dramatically in September of 1996. Paul Carlson was 38 years old, a former electrical engineer who had redirected his analytical mind toward paranormal research after experiencing what he described as an encounter with his deceased father. Unlike some investigators who approach the field with excitement or spiritual curiosity, Paul brought a skeptic's rigor to his work. He designed his own equipment. He insisted on control conditions. He had debunked more supposed hauntings than he had confirmed. His reputation in the paranormal research community was built on careful methodology and honest reporting, even when the results disappointed those hoping for proof of the supernatural. When Paul's team, the Connecticut Paranormal Research Foundation, received permission to investigate the Pickman house, he spent weeks preparing. He interviewed Tony and Lisa Pickman separately, taking detailed notes about the locations of activity, the timeline of escalation, the specific nature of the phenomena they reported. He requested copies of the recordings they had made, studying them for patterns. He researched the house's history before the Pickmans, finding nothing unusual. No deaths in the home. No tragic events on the property. Just an ordinary house built in 1972 on land that had previously been part of a farm. Paul's approach to the Pickman house investigation was systematic. He wanted to recreate the conditions under which Tony Pickman had experienced the most severe activity. Tony had reported that the attacks always occurred when he was alone, primarily in the master bedroom, most often between midnight and 4 in the morning. So Paul decided he would spend a night alone in that room, surrounded by monitoring equipment, while his team waited in a van parked across the street. On September 14, 1996, Paul Carlson entered the Pickman house at 9 in the evening. The sun had just set. The house had been empty for over 2 years by that point, and it showed the neglect. Dust covered every surface. The air smelled stale and faintly moldy. The electricity had been turned off, so Paul worked by flashlight as he set up his equipment in the master bedroom. He positioned 4 cameras at different angles to cover the entire room. He placed electromagnetic field detectors in each corner. He set up a digital thermometer with a remote display so his team outside could monitor temperature changes in real time. He positioned a high-sensitivity audio recorder on the dresser, and he kept a handheld radio at his side, maintaining constant communication with his team leader, Rebecca Marsh, who monitored everything from the van. At 11:30 that night, Paul settled into a folding chair in the center of the master bedroom. The cameras were recording. The equipment was functioning normally. The temperature in the room registered a steady 68 degrees. Through the radio, he could hear Rebecca's voice, calm and professional, confirming that all signals were coming through clearly. Paul began the session by speaking aloud, a standard technique in paranormal investigation. He introduced himself, explained why he was there, asked if any presence in the room would be willing to communicate. His voice sounded strange in the empty house, absorbed by bare walls and dusty carpet with no echo. For the first hour, nothing happened. Paul asked questions and paused for responses that didn't come. The electromagnetic field detectors registered no unusual readings. The temperature held steady. Paul's rational mind began constructing the report he would write, explaining that despite the Pickman family's experiences, no measurable phenomena occurred during a controlled investigation. Then, at 12:47 in the morning, the temperature began to drop. Rebecca's voice came through the radio, tense with sudden attention. She reported that the remote thermometer reading from the master bedroom had fallen 6 degrees in less than 2 minutes. Paul could feel it himself now, the cold settling over the room like something physical. His breath began to fog in the air. The cold wasn't uniform. It seemed to move, to concentrate. Paul described it later as feeling like standing in front of an open freezer, but the freezer was moving around him. The electromagnetic field detectors began to activate, their lights flashing in sequence around the room. Paul stood from his chair, turning slowly, trying to observe everything at once. His hands were shaking, but not from fear. From cold, ennui, from adrenaline, from the realization that something was actually happening. He began asking questions again, his voice steadier than he felt. Was someone there with him? Could they make their presence known? The audio recorder was running, capturing everything. Later analysis would reveal what Paul couldn't hear in the moment. Between his questions, in the pauses, the recorder picked up sounds. Low frequencies. Something that resembled breathing, but slower and deeper than any human breath. And then words, or something like words. A growling voice that seemed to form syllables. The audio technician who later analyzed the recording claimed it said "get out," though others who listened heard different words or no words at all. Paul noticed the cameras first. The indicator lights that showed they were recording began to flicker. He moved toward the nearest one, concerned about losing documentation of whatever was occurring. As he reached for the camera, it died completely. Then, the second camera. Then the third. Within 30 seconds, all 4 cameras had lost power simultaneously, despite being equipped with fresh batteries that Paul had personally installed and tested hours earlier. He grabbed for his radio, reporting the equipment failures to Rebecca. Her voice came back immediately, urgent now. The remote temperature reading had dropped to 42 degrees. She asked if he wanted to abort the investigation. Paul hesitated. Everything in his training, his methodology, his careful approach told him to stay, to observe, to document. This was what he had come for. Proof. Evidence. The kind of activity that couldn't be explained away. His hesitation cost him his chance to leave on his own terms. The attack, when it came, happened with shocking speed. Paul described it later as feeling like being hit by a car. An impact against his chest that lifted him off his feet and threw him backward across the room. He hit the wall with his right shoulder and ribs, the pain instant and overwhelming. He crumpled to the floor, gasping, unable to catch his breath. The wind had been knocked out of him. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Rebecca's voice on the radio, calling his name, asking what was happening. Paul tried to respond, but before he could form words, he felt something on his neck. Not hands exactly. He never saw what touched him, but he felt pressure, and then burning pain, as if something with claws was dragging across his skin. He screamed then, a raw sound of terror and agony. He scrambled backward across the floor, reaching for the radio, his training and methodology abandoned in the face of pure survival instinct. His hand found the radio. He pressed the transmit button and managed to gasp out 3 words. "Get me out. Now." Rebecca and 2 other team members, Marcus Chen and David Wolf, ran from the van toward the house. They later reported that as they approached, they could hear Paul screaming inside, though the master bedroom was on the 2nd floor. David had grabbed one of the portable cameras from the van. The footage from that camera still exists, shaky and chaotic, showing the 3 investigators running through the dark house, flashlight beams cutting through darkness, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They found Paul in the hallway outside the master bedroom. He had made it out of the room and collapsed against the opposite wall. His face was white. His hands were shaking violently, and across his neck, clearly visible even in the dim flashlight beams, were 3 deep scratches. They looked fresh, already beginning to bleed, running parallel from just below his left ear down to his collarbone. Rebecca made the decision immediately. No questions, no attempt to gather equipment, no discussion about documenting what had occurred. They got Paul out of the house. David kept the camera running as they helped Paul down the stairs and out the front door. The footage shows Paul's legs barely supporting his own weight, Marcus and Rebecca on either side of him, moving as quickly as they could toward the safety of the street. Once outside, with Paul sitting in the van, Rebecca made a quick decision that would prove crucial. She sent David back into the house, not to the second floor but just inside the front door, to retrieve the main control unit that was logging data from all the equipment. She gave him 60 seconds. Get in, grab the unit, get out. David's footage shows him running back through the front door, the camera bouncing with each step, sweeping across the empty living room to where the control unit sat blinking in the darkness. He grabbed it and turned to leave. That's when the camera captured what would become the most analyzed and debated piece of footage from the Pickman house investigation. For just under 3 seconds, as David turned toward the stairs, the camera's night vision picked up something on the landing above. A darkness, but not the absence of light. A presence of darkness, if such a thing is possible. A mass that seemed to absorb the night vision's infrared illumination rather than reflect it. The shape was roughly human but larger, and it appeared to be moving down the stairs toward David. David didn't see it in the moment. He only discovered it later when reviewing the footage. In real time, he simply felt overwhelming dread. A primal terror that sent him running from the house without conscious thought. The footage shows the frame jerking wildly, the image a blur of walls and doorways as David sprinted for the exit. The team took Paul directly to the emergency room. X-rays revealed 2 bruised ribs and soft tissue damage across his back and shoulder consistent with impact trauma. The scratches on his neck required cleaning and bandaging. They were deep enough to leave permanent scars. The attending physician asked what had happened. Paul, still in shock, simply said there had been an accident. The equipment that survived the investigation provided additional documentation. The audio recorder had continued running throughout the attack. It captured Paul's scream, the sound of impact, his labored breathing, and underneath all of that, a low-frequency sound that the audio technician described as similar to an animal growl, but with an underlying vibration that seemed almost mechanical. The temperature data showed the master bedroom had dropped from 68 degrees to a low of 39 degrees in the span of 17 minutes. Then, immediately after the team removed Paul from the house, the temperature had spiked upward, climbing back to 68 degrees in under 5 minutes. Such rapid temperature fluctuations in a closed room had no conventional explanation. But the most disturbing aspect of Paul Carlson's experience wasn't the evidence collected. It was the timeline. Tony Pickman had lived in that house for weeks before experiencing minor activity. Months before the scratches appeared. Nearly a year before the attacks became severe enough to drive his family out. Paul Carlson was violently assaulted within 3 hours of beginning his investigation. Whatever presence inhabited the Pickman house, it had changed, grown stronger, or perhaps more aggressive. The entity that had slowly escalated its attacks on the Pickman family over the course of a year now struck swiftly and brutally against anyone who entered its territory. Paul Carlson never entered another allegedly haunted location. He returned to electrical engineering and refused to discuss the Pickman house investigation publicly for nearly a decade. In a rare interview in 2006, he said simply that some questions aren't worth answering. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed. And some places are exactly what they appear to be. Dangerous. The footage David captured on the stairs, those 3 seconds of darkness descending, has been analyzed by video experts, debated by skeptics, and studied by believers. Some claim it shows nothing more than a camera artifact or a motion blur. Others see in that darkness a figure, a shape, something that was and possibly still is waiting in the Pickman house. The house stands empty today. No investigation team has entered it since Paul Carlson's assault. It serves as a warning within the paranormal research community. A reminder that some phenomena don't want to be studied, don't want to be understood. They simply want to be left alone. Or perhaps, more disturbingly, they want to be feared. The camera never lies, people say. But what happens when the camera captures something it was never meant to see? When the lens becomes a witness to forces that defy every natural law we understand? In the spring of 2006, the Booth brothers arrived at the Sallie House with their film crew, intending to document just another paranormal investigation for their documentary series. What they captured instead would become the most disturbing footage in the history of paranormal research, a climactic eruption of violence that suggested something inside that house had been growing stronger, hungrier, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The investigation began ordinarily enough. The Booth brothers had already established themselves as serious documentarians in the paranormal field, approaching their subjects with a mix of skepticism and open-minded curiosity. They brought with them professional equipment, multiple cameras, audio recording devices, and thermal imaging technology. But their most important asset that night was Debbie Kranick, a medium who had worked with the team on previous investigations. Debbie was known in paranormal circles as both talented and cautious, someone who approached spirit communication with respect and careful boundaries. She had participated in dozens of investigations without incident, maintaining her composure even in reportedly active locations. The crew trusted her completely. That trust would be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. The session began in the upstairs nursery, the epicenter of so much reported activity over the years. Debbie sat in the center of the room, surrounded by cameras positioned at multiple angles. Brad Yoakum, the primary cameraman, kept his lens focused tightly on her face, capturing every subtle shift in expression. The room was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and their breath created small clouds in the lamplight. Debbie closed her eyes and began her process, speaking softly into the darkness, inviting any present entities to communicate through her. The crew had seen this ritual many times before. They expected perhaps some automatic writing, maybe a few words channeled through the medium. They were not prepared for what came next. The change happened suddenly, violently, without warning. One moment Debbie sat peacefully with her eyes closed, her breathing steady and calm. The next moment her entire body went rigid, her spine arching backward at an angle that looked physically painful. Her eyes snapped open, but they were different somehow, the expression behind them foreign and cold. When she spoke, the voice that emerged was not her own. It was deeper, rough, carrying an edge of malice that sent immediate chills through everyone present. The voice identified itself as a protector of the house, a guardian who did not appreciate their intrusion. But that was just the beginning. What followed was a display that defied rational explanation. Debbie, or whatever was speaking through her, began revealing information about crew members that she could not possibly have known. She described childhood traumas, secret fears, private moments shared in confidence. She told Brad about his daughter's recent hospitalization, details that he had shared with no one on the crew. She spoke to Christopher Booth about his grandmother's death, repeating words that had been said at a private funeral service. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. These were not general statements or cold reading techniques. This was specific, verifiable information being channeled through someone who had no access to such details. Then her pupils began to change. Brad, still filming despite his growing unease, captured the moment in stark clarity. Debbie's pupils dilated until her eyes appeared almost entirely black, then contracted to pinpoints, then dilated again. The fluctuation happened rapidly, unnaturally, independent of the lighting conditions in the room. Medical experts who later reviewed the footage would struggle to explain this phenomenon. Pupil dilation is an involuntary response controlled by the autonomic nervous system, influenced by light, emotion, and certain substances. But this rapid fluctuation, this extreme cycling between dilation and constriction, suggested something was interfering with her basic neurological function. The personality speaking through Debbie began to shift. The voice changed pitch and tone multiple times, cycling between different accents and speech pattern. At moments she sounded like a young child, frightened and confused. Then the voice would deepen into something ancient and threatening. Then it would shift again into what sounded like a woman's voice, pleading for help. The crew realized they were witnessing something beyond simple possession. Multiple entities seemed to be fighting for control, using Debbie's body as a battleground for their own conflicts. That's when the violence began. Debbie's eyes, still cycling through their unnatural pupil changes, fixed on Brad. The malevolent voice returned, and she spoke his name with venomous hatred. Before anyone could react, she launched herself at him with shocking speed. Her fingernails raked across his face, leaving 3 deep scratches that immediately welled with blood. Brad stumbled backward, his camera swinging wildly, but somehow still recording. The footage captures everything. Debbie's transformed expression, the violent lunge, Brad's cry of pain and shock, and the bright red scratches appearing across his cheek and jaw. 2 crew members grabbed Debbie and pulled her back, but she fought against them with strength that seemed impossible for her small frame. She twisted and thrashed, screaming in that horrible shifting voice, speaking words that some crew members later described as Latin, others as something older and unrecognizable. It took 3 grown men to restrain her, and even then she continued to struggle with inhuman intensity. But the truly terrifying part was just beginning. As the crew struggled with Debbie, other members of the team began experiencing their own attacks. Christopher Booth, standing near the doorway, suddenly cried out as 3 scratch marks appeared across his arm, tearing through his shirt sleeve. He had been standing away from everyone, untouched by any physical hand, yet the scratches appeared spontaneously, as if drawn by invisible claws. The wounds burned, he would later report, with an intensity beyond normal scratches, a searing pain that radiated up his entire arm. Simultaneously, a production assistant named Jennifer collapsed to her knees, clutching at her back and screaming. When they lifted her shirt, the crew found fresh burn marks across her shoulder blades, circular patterns that looked disturbingly like fingerprints. The burns were already blistering, second-degree injuries that would require medical treatment. She had been standing alone, away from any heat source. There was no possible conventional explanation for the burns. The sound technician, Marcus, was shoved violently backward into the wall by an unseen force. The impact was captured on multiple cameras from different angles. One moment he stood upright, his boom microphone extended toward Debbie. The next moment he flew backward as if struck by an invisible hand, his body slamming into the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. He slid to the floor, dazed and bleeding from a cut on the back of his head. 5 people. 5 simultaneous attacks, all captured on film from multiple angles. This was not a case of suggestion or mass hysteria. These were physical injuries, documented in real time, happening to multiple people at once. The escalation suggested a coordinated attack, as if the entities in the house had mustered their combined strength for one overwhelming assault. Throughout all of this, Debbie continued to struggle and scream, her voice cycling through its disturbing range of personalities. She spoke prophecies of doom, threatened the crew with horrible fates, and revealed more impossible knowledge about their lives. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Debbie went limp in the arms of those restraining her, her eyes rolling back in her head. For a terrible moment, they thought she was dead. Then she gasped, a long, shuddering breath, and her eyes fluttered open. They were her own eyes again, confused and terrified. Debbie had no memory of what had occurred. The last thing she remembered was closing her eyes and beginning her meditation. Everything that followed existed in a complete blank, as if those minutes had been erased from her consciousness. When they showed her the footage later, she wept, horrified by what she saw herself doing and saying. The voice, she insisted, was not hers. The knowledge revealed was not hers. Whatever had spoken through her had used her as a vessel, wearing her body like a costume, while her own consciousness was pushed aside into darkness. The crew evacuated the house immediately, loading their injured members into vehicles and rushing to the nearest hospital. Brad's facial scratches required antibacterial treatment. Jennifer's burns needed specialized care for second-degree injuries. Marcus had a concussion from his impact with the wall. Christopher's arm wounds, though superficial, showed signs of infection within hours, despite immediate cleaning. It was as if whatever had caused the injuries had introduced something toxic into the wounds, something that resisted normal healing. The footage they captured that night remains the most compelling evidence ever recorded of paranormal violence. Skeptics have attempted to debunk it, suggesting everything from elaborate hoaxes to group psychosis. But the injuries were real, documented by emergency room physicians. The information revealed through Debbie was verified as accurate, details she had no possible way of knowing through conventional means. And most compelling of all, multiple cameras from different angles captured the same events simultaneously, eliminating the possibility of camera tricks or edited footage. What made this incident so deeply disturbing was not just the violence itself, but what it suggested about the nature of the entities inhabiting the Sallie House. In the years since the Pickman family's experiences, the activity should have diminished. Entities tied to specific locations typically maintain consistent patterns of behavior, neither growing stronger nor weaker over time. But this investigation suggested something different. The entities in the Sallie House appeared to be growing more powerful, more coordinated, more capable of manifesting physical effects in our reality. Some researchers have theorized that the constant attention, the parade of investigators and curious visitors, actually feeds the entities. Each person who enters seeking contact provides energy, attention, belief, all factors that paranormal theory suggests can strengthen spiritual manifestations. If this theory is correct, then every investigation, every documentary, every thrill-seeking visit to the Sallie House has been making whatever lurks there stronger. We have been feeding the very thing we seek to understand. Others suggest something darker. What if the entity, or entities, in the Sallie House have been learning, growing smarter, more sophisticated in their methods of interaction and attack? The progression of activity from simple scratches and pushes to coordinated multi-person assaults suggests an evolving intelligence, something that studies those who enter and adapts its approach. This possibility is perhaps more frightening than any other, because it suggests we are not dealing with residual energy or mindless spiritual phenomena, but with something that thinks, plans, and grows stronger with each encounter. The Booth brothers' investigation represents a climax in the Sallie House story, a peak of violent activity that crossed thresholds never before documented in paranormal research. But it also raises a troubling question. If this was the climax, what comes next? Does the activity subside, the entity exhausted by its massive display of power? Or does it continue to grow, feeding on attention and fear, building towards something even more terrifying? The house still stands on North 2nd Street in Atchison. The door remains open to those brave enough or foolish enough to enter. And inside, something waits in the darkness. Something that has proven itself capable of violence beyond anything previously recorded. The camera captured the truth that night in 26, but perhaps some truths are too terrible to witness, some doors too dangerous to open, and some houses too hungry to ever be satisfied. The Sallie House still stands at 612 North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas. Its Victorian facade unchanged, its reputation growing darker with each passing year. What began as the story of a little girl's ghost has evolved into something far more complex and deeply troubling, a mystery that refuses resolution even as evidence continues to accumulate in the present day. Walk past the house now, in the 2020s, and you might see tour groups gathered on the porch, cameras raised, digital recorders running. The house remains active, perhaps more so than ever before, and recent visitors continue to report experiences that mirror those of the Pickman family 3 decades ago. But with 30 years of additional investigations, interviews, and incidents to analyze, the questions have only multiplied, and the answers remain frustratingly out of reach. The first enduring mystery centers on selectivity. Why do the phenomena target specific individuals while leaving others completely untouched? During the Pickman years, Tony bore the brunt of physical attacks, while Debra experienced primarily psychological torment, and their infant son remained unharmed. This pattern has continued with remarkable consistency. Investigators report that in group sessions, one person might suffer scratches, burns, and violent pushes, while their colleague standing 3 feet away experiences nothing at all. Tour guides describe leading groups through the house where a single participant will emerge with fresh marks on their skin, while the other 15 people felt only cold spots or saw shadows. Some researchers have proposed that the entity or entities respond to specific personality types, perhaps drawn to skeptics whose disbelief presents a challenge, or alternatively attracted to believers whose openness provides easier access. Others suggest physiological factors might be involved, that certain individuals emit energy signatures that paranormal forces find appealing or threatening. But these theories fail to explain the randomness of selection. Debunkers and true believers alike have been attacked, men and women equally, young and old. The targeting appears arbitrary, yet clearly intentional, as if decided by an intelligence following rules we cannot comprehend. Then, there is the contradiction that troubles even seasoned paranormal investigators: the stark divide between the playful child phenomena and the brutal violence. Toys move. A girl's laughter echoes through empty rooms. Small handprints appear on mirrors. These manifestations suggest the presence of Sallie, the 6-year-old who legend claims died in the house during a botched appendectomy. But running parallel to these innocent activities are attacks of shocking viciousness. The deep scratches that appear in sets of 3, the burns that blister skin, the physical pushes down staircases. A child's ghost does not typically possess the strength or malevolence required to inflict such harm. The disparity suggests either a spirit with wildly fluctuating moods or, more disturbingly, the presence of multiple entities sharing the same space. Evidence has accumulated over decades that supports the multiple entity theory. Witnesses consistently describe encountering a little girl, a tall dark figure, and what some have called an oppressive masculine presence that radiates hostility. During electronic voice phenomenon sessions, researchers have captured what they interpret as different voices, some childlike and pleading, others deep and threatening. Thermal imaging has revealed cold spots appearing simultaneously in different rooms, suggesting concurrent manifestations that would be impossible for a single entity. Most tellingly, some visitors report feeling welcomed in certain areas of the house while sensing overwhelming danger in others, as if different territories are controlled by different forces. A paranormal team that investigated in 2021 documented an incident that exemplifies this multiplicity. In the nursery, equipment registered playful activity, balls rolling across the floor, a music box activating on its own, and team members reported feeling a gentle, almost protective presence. At the same moment, cameras in the master bedroom captured another investigator being scratched across the back with such force that his shirt tore, his screams echoing through the house, while the nursery activity continued undisturbed. Two entirely different interactions happening simultaneously, as if the house contained separate haunts with separate agendas. This raises the question that now dominates serious discussion about the Sallie House. Is Sallie real, or is something darker using her legend as camouflage? The possibility that the child ghost serves as a lure, a friendly face that draws people in before exposing them to something far more dangerous, has gained traction among researchers. The name Sallie itself might be part of the deception, a palatable story that makes the house seem less threatening than it actually is. After all, the historical record contains no verified death of a child named Sallie in that house. The appendectomy story, while plausible given the building's history as a physician's residence, remains folklore rather than documented fact. What if the true entity recognized early on that stories of a little girl ghost would attract curiosity rather than terror? What if Sallie is a mask worn by something that understands human psychology well enough to exploit our sympathy for dead children? The most disturbing reports come from sensitives and mediums who claim the childlike presence feels performative, a facade that slips occasionally to reveal something ancient and calculating underneath. Another unanswered question haunts researchers and former residents alike. Why does the violence seem to intensify rather than fade with time? Typically, paranormal activity diminishes as years pass, as if the energy sustaining it dissipates or the entity loses interest. The Sallie House defies this pattern. Incidents reported in the 2020s match or exceed the severity of those from the 1990s. A visitor in 2022 required medical attention after experiencing burns that appeared spontaneously on her forearms during a late-night investigation. A documentary crew, in 2023, captured footage of objects being thrown with enough force to shatter against walls, activity that surpassed anything recorded in earlier decades. Some theorize that increased attention feeds the phenomena, that each investigation, each tour group, each terrified visitor provides energy the entities can harvest and redirect into more powerful manifestations. Others believe whatever inhabits the house is growing stronger for reasons unrelated to human presence, perhaps following cycles we do not understand or building towards some unknown purpose. The escalation suggests intelligence and intention, a troubling indication that we are dealing with something far more complex than residual energy or emotional imprints. The house remains open for tours and investigations, a decision that sparks ongoing ethical debate. Should a location with documented history of physical attacks be accessible to the public? Tour operators maintain strict protocols, liability waivers, and limited group sizes, but the danger persists. The entities, whatever they are, remain hungry for contact. They do not sleep. They do not leave. They wait in that Victorian house on 2nd Street for the next person to walk through the door. Last month, a woman from Illinois visited the Sallie House as part of a regional ghost tour. She spent 45 minutes inside, reported feeling uneasy but experienced nothing dramatic during the visit. That night, back in her hotel room 15 miles away, she woke to burning pain across her shoulders. In the bathroom mirror, she photographed 3 fresh scratch marks, deep and perfectly parallel, carved into skin that had been unmarked hours before. The wounds were still healing when she contacted researchers a week later, thin scars that would serve as permanent reminders of her encounter. Whatever lives in the Sallie House, it does not respect boundaries of distance or time. It marked her. It let her leave. And then it reached out across the darkness to make sure she would never forget. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.